Welcome. In this module, we're going to be focused on sharpening our equity lens. In the following slides, you will be learning more about what that means and why that it's important to have equity in mind in our tutoring practices. This module was developed by Prospera Partners, which is a systems change-minded social impact consultancy. So let me make myself small here and let's get going. Boom. So our goal, by centering equity in our work, we actively generate inclusive spaces for all to learn in a safe and supported environment. But before we can create those spaces, we must understand what equity is. UC Berkeley's Initiative for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity defines equity as the guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement while striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. The principle of equity acknowledges that there are historically underserved and underrepresented populations, and that fairness regarding these unbalanced conditions is needed to assist equality in the provision of effective opportunities to all groups. So now that we have a definition of equity to work from, we want to build our understanding. So the next section is an opportunity to sit with the definition and ask a few questions that will help both you and us with our understanding of equity and why it's important. Reflecting on the definition we just shared, along with your personal experience, please answer the following questions. We encourage you to collect your initial responses in a 5 minutes reflection. Set a timer if that's helpful for you. After this module, we encourage you to look back at your responses to see if anything needs to be added before you share it with us. So you can use this on a Google Doc, separate Google Doc that you make, or a Word doc. So the questions we are asking you are, number one, when was the first time you became aware of the concept of equity? This could be in your lived experience, in your work, in school. Does equity and this awareness of equity look different depending on the space you're in? What does equity mean to you? And then how do you see an equity lens supporting your tutoring skills and process? So please pause this video for about 5 minutes. Take time with these questions, and when you're done, unpause and come back to me. Okay. Oops, going backwards. Okay. So we know what equity can look like for us as individuals in thinking of our work with others. It's also important to think of equity in practice. So we use community agreements as one of our ways of embodying equity as we're working with others. Often in our work with others, we start with sharing our community agreements, and then after sharing, there's a group consensus, understanding we have co-created these shared agreements. We also want to remind you that our work must be a flexible and emergent process. So this means that the community agreements can shift with the needs of the group. We encourage you to leave space to see if this is necessary. For example, you might include a reminder to resource yourself as needed, because sometimes, we can forget that it's okay to take a minute to drink some water, eat a snack. Sometimes our schedules can be so busy that it's, important to be okay with making sure the space is comfortable. So the agreements we have here are a great starting point, often used in our work. So all voices being heard and respected. Keeping in mind this acronym, WAIT, which is why am I talking and why aren't I talking? That encourages the next agreement to practice active listening, where we seek to understand, not just respond. We must also exercise compassion and empathy. Then lastly, we want to understand that accessibility, so checking in with each other, are there any needs that must be met that are going unseen or unaddressed? This might shift with each meeting. It's great to practice at the start of each session with a brief needs check-in. So now that we have a stronger container for understanding equity and how to generate a supportive environment, we want to touch on the larger motivations of developing an understanding regarding what is possible when we generate inclusive spaces that are not driven by white dominant culture. Here we go. Got my face. So in this section, we're going to have you take some time to read through a piece called White Dominant Culture and Tools for Something Different. Quoting here, we all have a culture which we express in observable ways through how we interact, what we value, and what we hold to be true. And no culture is better than another. As lovers of freedom and justice, we can aim to create inclusive spaces where we can bring our best and highest selves. At the same time, we can be mindful of how our environments impede our ability to unleash our unlimited potential. So pause for about 10 minutes to take some time to read through this PDF, White Dominant Culture and Tools for Something Different, which will be on this page that you're on under the resources. Excuse my dog. Okay, so now that you've come back, we're going to go to a reflection. We want you to reflect on that PDF and how it shows up for us. Again, both as individuals and in our work. So in this section, you're going to take another 5 minutes to reflect on the following questions. First of all, just what's coming up for you as you read this? Can you identify examples of a culture being white dominant in a workplace or school environment? And the examples you identified, imagine ways that this could be balanced, more equitable, and what could be done differently in those spaces. Where do you already see examples of equitable practices? So just pause here to reflect on these questions. Okay, so now that you're back after that reflection, it's important to recognize that white dominant culture goes beyond race, understanding we have a lot of complexity in who we are and our identities. One of the words for this is intersectionality, which is an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination or privilege. It was a term conceptualized and coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. So we want you to reflect on your personal experience through addressing factors. Pamela Hayes developed these addressing factors to understand our intersectionality. So take some time of reflection to write down your own addressing factors, which is age, developmental disabilities that's acquired at birth or in childhood. Then there's disabilities acquired later in life, your religion or your spiritual orientation, your ethnic and your racial identity, your socioeconomic status, your sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, gender identity. Have you considered the intersectionality of your experience before this activity? Has this shifted your understanding of inclusive spaces? Please take another 2 minutes just to sit with those questions. Anything else that's coming up for you? Like the other reflection, we encourage you to revisit the module to see if you'd like to elaborate or add any of your add to any of your responses. So I'll just take some time. You can pause and you can think about the addressing factors and what that might mean for you. Okay, so now that we have increased our understanding of intersectionality, this can be applied through our understanding of power, which is a relational force. It's not a fixed entity that operates in all interactions. While it can be oppressive, power can also be enabling. So by understanding our power, we enter our work with a larger self-awareness. For example, an able-bodied, white-presenting, cis-straight man, Christian man, will often enter a space at a higher perception of power, especially considering many environments are rooted in that understanding. So where someone who doesn't fit the same identities may not be able to hold or access the same power in a white space. So we can peel back another layer, understanding these dynamics that enter spaces when we examine intent versus impact. And this distinction is an integral part of inclusive environments, because an intent is what a person meant to do, and impact is the effect it had on someone else. Regardless of intent, it is imperative to recognize how behaviors, language, actions, etc. affect or influence other people. An examination of what was said or done and how it was received is the focus, and not necessarily what was intended. Keeping these concepts in mind in our sessions, we will co-create spaces that are inclusive, self-aware. We want to create the strongest container for being supported in learning. So, how do we do this? Well, there are many ways that we are able to center equity. One of these strategies is by actively unlearning. That is, discarding something learned, especially a bad habit or false or outdated information. Now, this is not to harp on the negative. In fact, the power of unlearning relies on embracing our own curiosity, navigating the buildings and the streets of our inner world, mindfully embarking on this self-journey and deciding what stays, what goes, what needs to be renovated, what needs to make space for the emotional garden that is living an authentic life. Because our most authentic selves can't bloom if we don't make space. And sometimes making space means saying no to what no longer works. Sometimes making space means grieving a life we once had, what we have believed in the past, what we thought was the only way things worked. That's a quote from Psychology Today. So the best process of unlearning leads us to actively prioritizing. By unlearning healthy and harmful narratives, we are then able to prioritize and center tools of equity. These include tools such as cultural competence, inclusive language, and micro-affirmations. It also means increasing our tolerance threshold, our acceptance and open-mindedness to different practices, attitudes, and cultures. This does not necessarily mean agreement with all of the differences, but just acceptance for what is. So knowing our intersectional identities and increasing our tolerance, we can embrace the power and beauty of learning environments that are created when we have spaces that are centered in equity. I also want to take a minute to pause and breathe. Because we are covering topics that carry quite a heavy weight. Each of these terms will sit with us differently as individuals. Do you have any barriers coming up? Emotional responses? So prioritize also a journaling practice or meditation or some other reflective tool when this tension comes up. Strengthening our ability to examine these challenging topics increases our tolerance and our collective resilience. So please pause here for just 2 minutes. Spend some time paying attention to your breath. Sit with what has been taught today. Give yourself some gratitude for showing up to this work. This has been a short introduction with a lot to process. So, as stated, we encourage you to take additional time with the reflections you've already made as you need. These are learnings that are meant to stick with us long term. So I want to end with a reminder that this work is emergent, continuous, and evolving, requiring an increased tolerance threshold and an ongoing education. So thanks for taking the time today to do this important work. We've included a glossary of terms you may want to keep in mind as you work with this literacy program. Remember that an ongoing journaling and reflection practice is a helpful tool as we sit with these concepts that could be new and sometimes challenging. Thanks for your participation. Remember to send in some of your reflections to read@raup.org, and we look forward to seeing that and to having you complete the rest of the modules as you go along. Thanks.